day, I've come to the last part of the story about Ben Blewett, who wanted to have a dog of his very own, and couldn't because he lived in the middle of London. For his birthday one year, his grandparents sent him a picture of a dog, a special kind of dog, a Chihuahua, the smallest breed in the world. And somehow, because Ben was so unhappy, he pretended the dog in the picture was real. But that still wasn't good enough. Then he heard that his grandfather's old dog Tilly had had 9 puppies, and his grandma said one of the puppies could be Ben's. Well, that was almost worse. Now Ben owned a dog, a real flesh and blood dog, but still he couldn't keep it in London. One day, Ben's family went to look at a new flat in North London. Mrs. Blewett wanted to live nearer her daughter, who'd just got married. And while everyone was busy, Ben went for a walk. He walked along 1 or 2 streets and round a corner, and there, stretching in front of him, he saw the biggest park in London, the wild, hilly expanses of Hampstead Heath. And he realised that if his mother really did decide to move, at last, he'd be able to have his dog. He started walking, hardly able to believe his eyes. None of the paths were properly made with asphalt or gravel. They were just dusty tracks that wound across the heath without any plan. After a bit he ran across the grass. There were no notices saying he couldn't. Wherever he went he saw dogs that ran without a lead and barked to their heart's content. Ben seemed to walk for hours, and still the heath went on. Suddenly, from the feel of his stomach, he thought he was probably very late for tea. He turned to go back and then realised in a panic that he didn't know where he was. Then he saw a man who seemed like a park keeper. "Please, could you tell me the way to get back?" Ben asked him, and described the green space where he'd left his 2 brothers playing football. "That would be Parliament Hill," said the keeper, and explained how to get back. Ben thanked him and then said, "Please, now what is it now? Please, said Ben, "can anyone take a dog on the heath and just let him run free? Are there no rules?" The park keeper looked horrified. "No rules? No bylaws? Of course there are. We can't have dogs getting out of control on the heath." As the keeper spoke, 2 dogs tore up the path on which he was standing. But the keeper took no notice. Ben was puzzled. "How exactly must they not get out of control?" he asked. "Well, biting people, mainly." Well, that was reasonable enough rule. Ben began to feel quite cheerful. The 2 dogs they'd seen before came past again. "And no lead," said Ben. "No, just so long as they're under proper control. Now off you go home the way I told you." Ben ran as light as air. He was so happy. He was late for tea, of course. When he got to May's flat, everyone had finished. They'd saved him some toast and cakes, but were too busy talking about the flat to be cross. But now it seemed that Mrs. Blewett couldn't make up her mind. May kept telling her how cheap it was, and Charlie, May's husband, said if the Blewetts didn't take it, someone else would. But Mrs. Blewett said the place seemed very poky. Ben just had to say something. "I like it," he said. "I like the house. I like where it is. I'd like to live here." Everyone laughed, and Ben was glad he hadn't said why he wanted to live there. They might have laughed at that too, but nothing was decided that day. There was only one other thing Ben must do. He must stop Grandpa finding another home for his dog. He hoped it wasn't already too late. That evening, he sat down and wrote a postcard to his grandfather which said, "Keep my puppy for me. We'll write more later." He posted it on Monday morning. He wouldn't let himself even think that by the time the card arrived, Grandpa might have found the puppy another home. On Tuesday, a letter came from Grandpa with a long message for Ben. 3 more of the puppies had gone. Now there was only 1 left. "Chiquitito," whispered Ben. It had been a near thing. His card must have crossed Grandpa's letter in the post. Grandpa would be warned by now. That morning, old Mr. Fitch read Ben's postcard aloud to his wife. Neither of them questioned keeping the puppy. It was Ben's. "As long as he takes it away some day," said Granny. "That's all." "Well," said Grandpa, "it sounds to me as if he's hoping to keep a dog in London after all." The idea gripped him. He was full of happiness for Ben. "All I hope is that he's not due for any disappointment," said Mrs. Fitch. Ben's parents could still not make up their minds to take the flat they'd seen that Sunday. It was not exactly what Mrs. Blewett had hoped for, she said. On the other hand, she had to admit that other flats were usually more expensive or less convenient, or farther away from May and Dilys. Slowly, she was coming round to it. But would it be in time? So Ben held his breath. He would not allow himself to show emotion. He tried not to count on having a dog. He tried not to think about a dog. But he could not think about anything else properly at all. The dog that he had chased from his thoughts in the daytime crept back into his dreams at night. Tilly's tiny brown puppy, who was also the minute, intrepid, and altogether extraordinary Chihuahua, named Chiquitito. Ben called him by that name, as in his dreams they roamed Hampstead Heath together. At last, Mrs. Blewett made up her mind, and the flat had not been snapped up by anyone else, so the Blewetts were able to have it. But even then, Ben hardly dared breathe freely. So much could still go wrong. One day, when Mrs. Blewett was in the middle of packing things into tea chests, Ben said, "Oh, by the way, I could have a dog when I'm living in the new flat, couldn't I?" Mrs. Blewett nearly dropped the clock she was wrapping up. "Really I could," Ben went on, and before she could say anything at all, he told her how close their new home was to the heath, that he could exercise the dog properly, that he himself would see to its feeding and washing, and see it didn't leave mud or hairs around the house. When he'd finished, there was silence. Then Ben's mother said kindly, "If it's possible to have a dog, Ben, of course we'll have it. We always had one when we were children." Ben's two young brothers, Frankie and Paul, began to get interested in the puppy and wanted to know what he looked like. "Well," said Ben, "he's small and sort of lightish brown and very bold and brave." "What are you going to call him?" Mr. Blewett wanted to know, and immediately everyone started suggesting names. Rover, Jack, Laddie. "But he's got his own name already," said Ben. "Grandpa calls him Brown, but his real name's Chiquitito." "What?" said everyone at once. "Chiquitito." "Oh, you can't call him that, Ben," said Mr. Blewett. "His name's Brown." "Chiquitito," said Ben. Then they all told him what an absurd, unthinkable name it was for a dog. But Ben was stubborn, and in the end they gave up. They decided Ben should wait until after the move before he went and fetched the dog. And when all the bumping and crossness was over, Ben wrote to his grandparents and arranged to come down for the day. Grandfather wrote him a postcard that read, "Bring muzzle for journey." A muzzle is something you put over a dog's mouth to stop him biting people. It was a British Railways regulation for dogs. So, one Saturday, Ben set off in the train for Castleford with the muzzle and a collar and lead with a silver name and address plate on it. Nothing, surely nothing could go wrong now. Even the weather was perfect, and the May was flowering all along the hedgerows. When he got off the train, Grandpa said, "He's waiting at home for you." When they came to the house, Granny was sitting outside. Almost at once a dog started barking. Ben saw him. He saw that the dog was almost as large as Tilly, and coloured chestnut brown. The dog saw Ben. He stopped and stared. "He's not used to strangers," Grandpa said softly. "But go on, lad, call him. He's your dog." Ben said, "He's so big and brown. I didn't expect it." "Well, it's a good while since you saw him. Call him. Go on." Ben glanced at his grandfather and then called, "Chiquitito." The dog took a step backward. Ben called out again, and then the dog fled round the corner of the house. "What did you call him?" said Grandpa. But Grandma knew. She remembered that that was the name of the dog in the picture. "Don't be silly," said Grandpa. "You can't go changing a dog's name like that. It only confuses him. Besides, that dog is brown. You can't change that any more than you can change his nature." But Ben refused to listen. Later in the afternoon, when the time came for Ben to leave, Grandpa fastened the collar round the dog's neck, and Ben clipped on the lead. Ben said his goodbyes and set off to catch the bus. Chiquitito Brown would only go with him by being dragged in a sitting position at the end of the lead, and in the end Ben had to carry him. Grandma watched him go. "People get their heart's desire," she said, "and then they have to learn to live with it." Ben sat in the guard's van all the way to London and refused to look at Brown. He wanted a dog who was small and light brown and brave, and his dog was none of these things. Ben was sick with disappointment. When Ben got back to London, he felt he just couldn't go straight home. He carried his dog away from the tube station and to Hampstead Heath, and there he put him down and unfastened the lead. He gave it a push. "Go away, you," he said. The brown dog moved a little way off, and then sat down. He was frightened of the strange, noisy journey he'd just made, and frightened of this boy who was so unfriendly to him. Ben set off angrily across the heath, and the dog followed him. He knew by now that Ben did not want him, and so he did not really want Ben. But Ben was all he had. So the two of them crossed the heath together, but not in companionship. Ben walked until it started to get dark, and then he sat down at the top of a little hill. He was alone on the heath now, except for the brown dog, who still followed, but farther off. Ben knew that if he called the dog by the name he was used to, he would come. But if he never called him, in time, the dog would wander away. He'd be a nameless, ownerless dog that some policeman might find. He looked up, and the slope in front of him was empty. So, the brown dog had gone, at last. Did Ben care? He remembered his shame on the bus, when the big brown dog sat trembling on his knee, and the conductor said, "He needs a bit of cuddling." He'd done so without kindness or pity. He felt a disappointment that made him cruel. Ben let his head fall forward onto his knees, and wept for that small, brave dog that he could not have. Other people had the dogs they wanted, but he could not have Chiquitito. He opened his eyes and watched the light fade. And then, when it was so dark Ben could hardly see, he saw clearly. He saw that you couldn't have impossible things however much you wanted them. And if you didn't have the possible things, you had nothing. The brown dog wasn't at all like the Chiquitito he wanted. But Ben remembered the warmth of the dog's body as he carried him, and the way the dog had pressed up to him for protection, and had followed him, even in hopelessness. And now the dog was gone, and he suddenly realized what he had lost. "Brown!" he shouted. "Brown!" He heard the dog's answering barks even before he saw him. The dog was galloping towards him out of the dark, barking so excitedly that Ben had to crouch down and put his arms round him to quieten him down. The dog's tongue slapped all over his face. "It's all right, Brown," he said. "I'm here." Then Ben stood up again, and Brown stayed by his side, leaning against his leg, panting, loving him. And lovingly Ben said, "Come on, Brown, let's go home. Goodbye."